Shockingly, 62.5% of credit applications are rejected at the moment. So how fundable are South African consumers? Well, let's have a look at those rejection rates. If we look at the total number of credit applications made prior to the lockdown period, we can see that that ranged between 10 and 12 million credit applications per quarter. Into the hard lockdown quarter 2 of 2020, and the volume of credit applications dropped to 5.8 million. Numbers last seen in the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. However, during the global financial crisis, we can see that only 40% of credit applications were rejected. Fast forward back to quarter 2 of 2020, and that number spikes out at 67.4%. There has been a recovery in the number of applications. We're back up to 10 million credit applications per quarter, but no recovery yet in the amount of rejections, which currently still sits at 62.5%. So how does that translate then in terms of credit granted? Well, if we have a look at the total volume and value of credit granted in South Africa, we can see that there are 27.5 million credit active consumers. And collectively, we have 85 million credit agreements. The number of credit agreements, though, deteriorating or dropping from 90 million the quarter before to where we are currently at 85 million credit agreements collectively. In terms of the value of credit granted on a quarterly basis, we can see that in the hard lockdown quarter 2 of 2020, that only 54 billion rands worth of credit was granted. There was recovery, and 154 billion new credit was granted in quarter 4 of 2020 and has stabilized to 138 billion rand of new credit granted in the first quarter of 2021. And that collectively makes up the 2 trillion rand of credit granted in total. Let's look at what those agreements are. So 2 trillion rands worth of credit in total, of which 51% of that, 1 trillion rand of that, goes towards our mortgages. 22% of that 2 trillion rand is secured credit. 13% of that 2 trillion rand are credit facilities. 10% of that 2 trillion rand is unsecured credit, and short-term credit makes up less than 0.1% of that 2 trillion rand. In terms of the number of accounts, a little bit of a different story. We have, as I said, 85 million credit agreements, of which 5% goes towards mortgages. So high value, low volume. Secured credit makes up 9%, credit facilities making up the bulk of the volume of credit, being 68%, unsecured credit makes up 13%, and short-term credit makes up only 1.7%. Let's delve a little deeper into the mortgages then. So as we know, there's 2 trillion rand of credit in South Africa. 51% of that is for mortgages, and that's 1 trillion rand. In terms of the gross debtors book made up on a per quarter basis, we then want to have a look at the number of mortgages provided on a quarterly basis. And we can see that ranges at the 40,000 mark, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, into the hard lockdown quarter, and the number of mortgages deteriorates down to 12,000 mortgages granted in quarter 2. Absolute recovery in the second half of 2020, peaking out in the last quarter of 2020 at 53,000 new mortgages granted for that quarter, and stabilizing back in quarter 1 to 45,000 new mortgages granted in the first quarter of 2020. Of course, we can see the value increase, which we would expect it to do as house prices increases. The value of mortgages will increase in line with that as well. 62 billion rands worth of new mortgages provided in the last quarter of 2014. Looking at that on a per annum basis, we can have a look and see that on average, we have 165,000 mortgages granted per annum. The number of mortgages in 2009 is 140,000, and therefore in the pandemic period of 2020, the number of mortgages granted at 148,000 absolutely seems reasonable. But it's not just about mortgages granted. So we can see that mortgages granted a little bit off where it was in the decade leading up to the 2020 period. It's not just about the mortgages granted. The reality is it's about the number of sales transfers on a per annum basis because we have cash and bonded values. So we can see that in the 2003 period, and here we're looking at residential transfers of sales to natural people. And here we can see that in the 2003 year, the number of transfers peaked out at 475,000. In the global financial crisis of 2009, that number deteriorated, halved, down to 229,000 transfers in that particular year. It then stabilized between 250 and 270,000 transfers per annum up until 2018, 2019, where the number of transfers weakened again down to 235,000 per annum. Enter the pandemic year of 2020, and the number of transfers deteriorates again by 15% to 199,000. But if we add the bonds back in, we can see that the transfers in 2020, what made up the loss of numbers, were in fact the cash sales, because the banks were still supporting the mortgage, the credit provided into the marketplace at 143,000 mortgages against the 199,000 sales transfers in total. We can have a look at the period between 2001, where 230,000 mortgages were provided, peaking out at 300,000 in the 2006 during that property boom period, just before the National Credit Act was promulgated. And the reduction in the number of bonds is as a result of the reduction in the number of sales transfers in the next 10 years. So let's look at it by decade then. If we look at sales transfers to residential properties for natural people, we can see that in the 1990s, the total number of sales were 2.9 million sales, supported by 50% mortgage agreements, 1.4 million mortgage agreements. The first decade of 2000, the property boom period, we can see that 3.8 million sales transaction to the residential market for natural people, supported by 60% bonds, or 2.7 million bonds provided in that decade. Enter the global financial crisis and the decade post the global financial crisis, and we can see that the number of sales per decade has now weakened to 2.5 million, but the banks have increased lending to 62%, or 1.6 million transactions. And now, the last 18 months during a worldwide pandemic, we can see that the number of sales transactions sitting at 240,000, supported by 70% mortgages, or 167,000 mortgage agreements in the last 18 months, being the period 2020 and the first half of 2021. So let's look at that, because that's fascinating. The banks are absolutely supporting property sales at the moment in terms of the percentage of transactions which are being sold with mortgage agreements, indicating that the number of cash buyers out there in market has definitely deteriorated. So if we go back to 1998, we can see that only 28% of property transfers were supported by a mortgage agreement. That number increasing up to 72% in 2007. Boom, we have the National Credit Act, and that number deteriorates back down to 60 to 65% per annum of the number of sales transactions to the residential market for natural people are transacted with a mortgage. As we can see in the 2020 pandemic period, the number of sales with bond increasing up to 72%. So now we know the value of the gross debtors book in terms of the amount of credit South Africans have outstanding at the moment, which is 2 trillion rand. Let's have a look at how we're paying that 2 trillion rand off. Well, the first thing is we've got our mortgage agreements. The roof over your head being both the mortgages and the rentals. And we can see that 91.53% of mortgages are paid in current. And that's an improvement from where it dropped down to 89% in the hard lockdown quarter. Rentals sitting next at 78% of consumers in good standing with their rent. An improvement from where it dropped in the hard lockdown period down to 73.5%. So mortgages make up 1 trillion rand of that total credit lent. It's 51% of the gross debtors book, is 1.6 million credit agreements, and 91.5% of those agreements are in current. Next up, we've got our credit facilities. This makes up 13% of the gross debtors book, an amount of 264 billion rand. There are 24.5 million accounts in the credit facilities group. We've got credit and garage cards, which make up 1/3 of the value, and we've got store cards, which make up 2/3 of those volumes of the 2.4 million credit active agreements. In terms of our credit facilities, 74.19% of these credit facilities are in good standing. Next up, we've got our secured credit. Our secured credit makes up 22% of the value of the gross debtors book, which is 446 billion rand. The total number of accounts are 3.3 million accounts, and this is made up of vehicle finance, which is 93% of that value of 456 billion rand, but it is 40% of the volume of those 3.3 million credit active accounts. This grouping of credit agreements is sitting at 73.10% in good standing. Next up, we've got our short-term credit. Our short-term credit makes up 1.9 billion rand of the gross debtors book. It's only 0.09%. It's 1.7% of the number of agreements, that being 610,000 credit agreements. And our grouping of short-term credit is at 70.52% in current. That is an improvement of 1 in 2 accounts that were in arrears in the hard lockdown quarter, where only 50% of consumers were in good standing with their short-term credit in that particular quarter. And last, we've got unsecured credit. This makes up 1.9 billion rand of the total 2 trillion rand that's been lent. It makes up 4.7 million accounts of those 85 million accounts. It's 10% of the gross value of the debtors book, or 13% of the total number of agreements. It's 213 billion rand, of which 67.26% of that is in current. So this is an area which has been the most affected by the pandemic period. So that brings us back to the question, how fundable are consumers at the moment? Here I want to bring back all the data on consumer behavior into a single line item of good standing from a credit perspective. This is where we look at the Credit Bureau Monitor, and we look at the number of consumers that are in good standing in terms of their credit profile. Currently, 61.8% of consumers are in good standing in terms of their overall credit profile. But it has been supported by legislative changes in the past. For example, in 2014, we had the credit amnesty, and this had the result that it improved the number of consumers in good standing up to 55.8% at the time. We then had the National Credit Act amendments, which changed that adverse and judgment information would be removed where the consumer paid up their adverse or judgment arrears, and that had an improving effect on consumers in good standing. And lastly, we had the payment relief or the payment holiday that was provided during the pandemic period, and this had the result that it would not have a negative impact on consumers' credit profiles for the period where they had entered into a debt rearrangement, or payment holiday period with their credit providers. Ultimately though, 61.8% of consumers are in good standing with their credit profiles. What does that mean then in terms of how fundable our consumers are? In the last 12 months, there have been 35 million applications for credit agreements. Overall, in the last 12 months, there have been a 65% rejection rate. What is desperately required at this stage is economic recovery and, more importantly, job recovery in the market.